Okay. Let's pick up where we left off, shall we? Here, like, I brought on in. Right. Okay. So we left off at muscle relaxation, right? So we have, we did the contraction piece of it just to kind of remind you of kind of where we are, right? So we kind of basically did the deep dive. We essentially released calcium. We kind of went to that whole sarcomeric shortening, right? That sliding filament kind of idea. And then you basically shortened your sarcomeres across multiple muscles. Now for relaxation, remember, this is your reset. So you're resetting the system. And not only that, but what you're looking at is you're looking at the activity of these ATP dependent pumps. Because remember, you just got done releasing a ton of calcium. You just got done releasing a ton of sodium, right? So those membranes are repolarizing, kind of shutting all those gates, and then they are basically rebuilding those sodium concentration gradients and those potassium concentration gradients, right? We just talked about that piece of it. So you already sprung that mousetrap. So they're resetting their mousetrap. And now with the calcium gating, you're also doing the same thing, right? So ultimately you have the reset of the action potential. That's going to be happening in number one. You're going to be detaching. Of course, you want to detach everything. That is to say your cross bridges, because you don't want to hang on to it forever. Right, so we have to add the ATP, which is the trigger for detachment of those cross bridges. That gets the myosin to let go. Once you let go, then you can open those sarcomeres back up. They can slide back open. That's the relaxation piece of it, and you can kind of reset that sliding part of it. And then also you have calcium reclamation, right? So at this particular point, you can see here you've got a calcium pump that is busy pumping that calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So everybody's resetting their systems, right? You're resetting and repolarizing your membrane to receive the next action potential. You're detaching your myosin cross bridges so that you can open back up your sarcomeres, relaxing your muscles. And then you're repackaging your calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so by the way, rigor mortis is caused by what? Muscles not being able to relax, basically, right? What actually causes it? Well, what causes it is the ATP detachment piece of it. That's what's defective, right? Because when you die, you're no longer making ATP. So there's no more ATP around to attach to the cross bridges to get them to let go. As a result, what happens is you have perpetual cross bridge attachment, and that basically means your muscles are perpetually shortened, which is the reason why you stiffen up, because it's like a seizing of the muscles. It's like your muscles are all tensed up and contracted. But we all know, maybe not all of us, but we do now, that rigor mortis doesn't last forever, does it? After a few hours, eventually the body will limber back up. What causes that? Decay. Because over time, what's going to happen is those cross bridges can't hang on forever. And eventually, naturally, they'll degrade. And then when they degrade, they'll just basically fall off. And then slowly over time, as they fall off, then the muscles will limber back up and you can move them around, right? So that's basically what's causing rigor mortis. So if you're into mortuary science, you can't prep the body during rigor mortis. You got to wait for them to exit rigor mortis, and then you can move the body around and position them and things like that. Okay. So that's just if you're into that sort of thing. If not, yeah, but that's a thing, right? That's a real thing, because you have to be able to deal with the body and work the body if you're a mortuary science. Yeah.
I've seen things in river before. So basically, the body processes stop.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever processes you guys that would normally happen stop because you're not. So
yep.
What causes it?
You have to detach your cross bridges. And remember from our ATP cycle, where the cross bridge detachment happens when ATP binds to the myosin. That's the signal for detaching of the cross bridges. But if you're dead, you're not making ATP anymore. So your cross bridges are permanently attached. There's nothing to detach them until they naturally degrade and just let go through decay. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of an important, right? Because when you're looking at mortuary science, I mean, that's one of the things that we don't realize is, I mean, the body kind of looks nice for a little while, right? We're kind of like, oh, this kind of looks like they're sleeping or whatever, right? But what you don't realize is at a cellular level, as soon as you die, like you said, there's a cessation of oxygen. As soon as you stop oxygen, all of your cells are dying. So at a cellular level, you have basically rampant cell death throughout the entire body. So all those chemical reactions have stopped. All the tissues and the structures are beginning to degrade because the cells don't last long without oxygen and nutrients. And so they start to degrade, and already immediately they start to kind of, we don't see it on the outside, but throughout the rest of the body, throughout the entire body on the inside, that's what's happening. So there's like rampant cell death. Yeah. Well, even the smell takes a little time to kick in, at least to depend on where you are, right? I mean, if you're out in the sun, not so much time. If you're in a freezer, it takes a little bit more time, right? If you're embalmed, like Lennon, apparently, then you last forever. But anyway, so let's take a look at some muscle physiology, shall we? So basically, when we take a look at muscle physiology, we're going to be taking a look at what we refer to as muscle twitch. Now, we've already looked at the depolarization curve, right? Because we've already looked at the resting membrane potential, the depolarization, and then the repolarization, right? So we've already seen that piece of it. But now what we want to do is we want to look at the consequence of that, the contraction cycle. So here you can see you've got tension plotted against time. That's muscle tension. So you can see basically what you have is a couple of different phases. The first one is what's called lag phase. Now, lag phase is called lag because this is basically the beginning portions of it. So this is when your stimulus first enters and is busy going down the sarcolemma, down into the T-tubule. It hasn't released anything yet. So that's kind of takes a little bit of time. So there's a little bit of a lag there before you actually get some sort of a visible muscle response to it. So that's what's happening, is that lead up to the release of calcium. That's happening in lag or the latent phase. Then once you release calcium, then you're going to get a contraction, which is going to be this front end of the curve. That's because of calcium release. So lag basically happens from 0 to calcium release. And then once you get calcium release, then you're going to get contraction, right? Because you're going to pull that rapamycin off. You're going to form your cross bridges, and you're going to pull, and you're going to get that sliding filament model thing kicking in. And then you're going to get your contraction. And then once you contract fully, then your ATP is going to attach to your cross bridges. You're going to detach. You're going to start to reclaim all of your calcium. You're going to reset your depolarized membranes in your sarcolemma in the first place. And you basically go through the backside of things, which is your relaxation phase. And you basically reset the system. Ready for another stimulus. So when we take a look at muscle contractions, we have a couple of different types of muscle contractions. You have some contractions where basically you have an increasing tension. So tension will increase, but you don't have an increase in length. So a good example of this are muscles that are kind of constantly contracting, but they're rotating muscle fibers. So you'd see kind of constant activity, but when you actually look at the actual muscle fibers, the actual individual muscle fibers aren't the same ones all the time. They're kind of rotating like pitchers rotating a baseball team, kind of from one to the next to the next to the next. The postural muscles are a good example of this isometric sort of a thing, where you have essentially, they don't shorten. How do you know that? Because if they did, you'd bend over backwards the opposite way, right? Like the spinalis muscles, which are postural muscles, if those shortened, you can basically do that, right? Every single time they contract. Not a good idea, right? So these would be isometric. Isotonic then basically is where you have a change in length, but you have constant tension. So this basically is like when you have constant load. Like for instance, if I'm holding a particular load, I have a change in length, right? For instance, my bicep is shortened, but I have constant tension happening here, right? Because I'm maintaining this thing in the air. I'm not just having individual tensions. Yes, I hear it too. It's upstairs.
Okay.
Yeah, there's piping like right over our head. Upstairs comes downstairs, and so that's what you're hearing. Yeah, somebody's draining something up there. So there's like a bunch of research labs just above us. Right, so that's the isometric versus isotonic. Now, if you get into like kinesiology and fitness, and you really get into a lot more depth of isotonic versus isometric, because when you're talking about different types of body exercises, workouts, and things of that nature, when you're targeting muscles, some are isometric, some are isotonic, some are, so different types of movements are different ones. And so depending on what you're trying to target, you're going to be hitting different types of groups. And so you hear a lot about that. But the important thing is, in terms of organization that we want to take a look at then, is the organization of the muscle fibers themselves. So here, just to kind of show you here, we have each of these individual circles is a muscle fiber, okay? And then inside you can see these myofibrils. Now, the way the muscle fibers are attached, and we've already talked about neuromuscular junction, because here's our axon of our motor neuron. What happens is our axon will basically break out into what's called telodendria. And then each of them will have like this little foot-like, almost like a little gecko foot attached to a muscle fiber. And so they're kind of attached pretty much everywhere. So every muscle fiber has an attachment from the motor neuron. So a single motor neuron basically will innervate what's called an entire motor unit. So one motor neuron to one motor unit. And so they'll be touching on lots of different fibers in that unit. Now you can think of a motor unit as basically a group or a cluster of muscle fibers that kind of are sort of operating or working together. Just like you can think of a pitching rotation as a group of baseball pitchers that kind of work together as a group, right? So they are the starters. They're the ones to start the baseball game. And so just like also with motor units, you have multiple motor units in a muscle itself. So your muscles, especially your skeletal muscles, are organized into multiple motor units. So for instance, whenever I basically have a load like this, where I have constant tension occurring like in my bicep, not all of the muscle cells or muscle fibers are contracting at the same time. What you have is you have the deployment of specific motor units, just enough to manage the load, right? So one motor unit at a time will be basically responding to the load. What happens is, after a certain amount of time, that motor unit will go off duty, just like a pitcher will go on 4 days rest after he starts a game. And then the next pitcher in the rotation will take over. So it rotates from one motor unit to another motor unit to another motor unit. For as long as I'm holding this load, it'll just keep rotating. That's the reason why I can hold this load for an indefinite period of time, is because my individual motor units have some time off where they can rest. And then when they take it over, they're fresh and they can basically maintain the load. And then they get tired, they go off rest, and then they go off duty basically, right? And they kind of rest. And so you kind of keep rotating for as long as I need to hold this load. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So very quickly, because otherwise what happens, you feel kind of a jerkiness, right, in your muscle as you're kind of switching over from one to the other. So it's rotating like constantly. And that kind of helps you keep a nice, even, consistent load across the entire muscle. Now let's take a look at our motor units. The important thing is you can actually increase or have as many motor units as you want. It's an organizational thing, okay? But remember, all the motor units are going to have innervations to the motor neuron. So basically every muscle fiber is going to have a connection to the neuron. So nobody's not going to have some signal. Everybody will hear what they need to hear. Now, since you can have some play in terms of how you organize this, let's take a look at some of the consequences. So in some cases, you can build a motor unit with lots and lots of muscle fibers in it, right? Typically, if you do that, these are going to be large muscles, which will largely be associated with gross motor control. heavy stuff, right? Like your biceps, things like that. It's not going to be fine-tuned stuff. You're just basically lifting something and that's it. So you have a lot of power in there, because the more muscle fibers you recruit, then the more power you're going to have, right? And so your large muscles tend to have motor units with lots of muscle fibers in them. Small muscles tend to have motor units with few muscle fibers. So basically, the smaller that is, means you have more fine motor control, which actually is perfect example, right? Because if you take a look at your bicep, large muscle, lots of fibers in the motor unit, but its movement is gross motor control, right? Now, if you compare that to your extensors in your forearm, much smaller muscles, right? Fewer muscles per motor unit. So that's the reason why you have so many extensors that are basically the same size, because you have more motor units, but fewer muscle fibers per unit. What that means is you can do more fine motor control. So I can do something like this that I can't do that fine motor control with the larger muscles. Okay. So you can kind of organize this basically however you want. Now, let's take a look at the individual muscle fibers, right? So essentially, when you take a look at muscle fibers themselves, that is to say the cells of them, your muscle contractions can vary, right? So you can either go from weak or to strong, and you can sort of increase, right? So you can increase your tension slowly over time. And so you can do a lot actually with your tension, if you think about it. It's not an all or nothing thing, right? Which is really helpful because this gives us kind of graded tension. This graded tension really allows us to be able to kind of fine tune what kind of tension we need in order to match our load, which is important, right? Because I want to match my tension to this load. What happens if I overmatched my tension to this load? Yeah, I'd be throwing it, right? So that wouldn't be good. So you want to be able to control that so you're not throwing it. Now, what if I wanted to throw it? Well, I could do that, right? I just basically increase more tension and I'm going to throw it, right? So you can have all that, lots of control over how you're looking at it. A lot of times we just think of muscle contraction as just an all or nothing thing. Contract it, lift it, right? But really there's a lot of nuance and a lot of variation, a lot of gradations associated with contraction. You can do a lot of things with it. So what basically will affect contraction? By the way, let's just kind of clear something up. Contraction is proportional to your cross bridge formation, right? The more cross bridges you form, the more tension you'll create, right? So there is a proportion there. But the question is, how do you actually affect contraction strength, right? So how do I keep this constant tension going on? Well, there's a couple of things happening in order to sort of increase this contraction, or to modulate this contraction. The first one is clearly the frequency of stimulation. How often am I sending a nervous impulse to contract, right? How often is that contract signal coming in? Well, if it's coming in very slowly, contract, and I wait a half an hour, what's going to happen? I'm going to contract, I'll meet the load, but then what's going to happen? It's going to relax, and I'm going to drop it, right? 30 minutes later, I'll do another contraction. So the frequency of stimulation is one way to kind of create this force of contraction. Also, your muscle fiber diameter, that is to say, how much myofibril is in there. And then your muscle fiber length, right? At the time of contraction, that is the extent of relaxation. If you want a complete 100% contraction, then you have to reset the mousetrap 100%, right? If the mousetrap is only at 50%, guess what? You're only going to get 50% contraction. So depending on how much the mousetrap is sprung will dictate how much you can contract the next time around. Okay, so you have to fully reset. Fully relax will give you full contraction. Partial relaxation will give you partial contraction, right? Or a weaker contraction. So those are some of the major things. Now, one of the important things to to remember is when you're building muscle bulk, you're not building bigger muscles. What you're doing is you're increasing muscle fiber diameter. You're building myofibrils, not adding muscle cells. Does that make sense? Unless they're damaged, of course, then you have to replace those muscle fibers. But generally speaking, you're increasing diameter and bulk of existing muscle fibers as opposed to adding new fibers to the muscle. Does that make sense? Same thing's also true, by the way, we see in adipose tissue. You don't lose fat cells. What you do is why liposuction is a bad idea. Because what you're doing is you're taking away cells. Even when you lose weight, you're not taking away your adipose cells. You're just removing the lipids that are in the adipose cells, but you always have your adipose cells. And generally speaking, they don't divide. And so that's a bad thing. So somebody who has liposuction, if they go on a bender again and they eat, then they don't have the fat cells to store all the extra food that they've eaten. That is a physiologically dangerous place to be because that fat's going to go somewhere. And it's probably going to go in areas that are going to probably cause problems. Okay, so let's take a look at some frequency of stimulation. A particular pattern called TREP or TREPFA, German word. So typically what we get is we get calcium release. So here's our same file, right? So we see our lag time, our contraction, and our relaxation. So basically we get our calcium release up on the first stimulation. And then we get the release of the calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then we have muscle relaxation completely between muscle twitches. But generally speaking, what happens in TREPA is that with the stimulus, the second stimulus, will cause a little bit of an additional release of calcium. Now, what this does is it kind of primes the pump, right? So when you get to TREPA, what happens is you go through your sarcoplasmic reticulum releasing, I guess, your cross bridge formation. And then when you do TREPA, what happens is the first contraction primes the pump for the next one. So basically what it does is it's, where did I see that? I want to underline that one. There it is. So having this calcium concentration makes your next contraction more efficient. So what you see in TREPA is something that looks like this. You see kind of like a small contraction, relaxation, but then with an immediate stimulus right on the back of it, you'll see a little bit of a stronger contraction, and you'll see a little bit of a stronger contraction, and a little bit of a stronger contraction. So you can see you're kind of grading yourself up. It's like each previous contraction is sort of priming the pump for the next one to make it more efficient. This is one of the reasons why you do warm-up exercises, is to get those muscles firing at maximum peak contraction. So that's kind of what TREPA is. And so then eventually you can kind of bring that back down. So the other types of patterns that we see in twitch formation, right? Twitch patterns, basically, if you will, is what's called wave summation and then tetanus. And there's two different types of tetanus. There is what's called incomplete tetanus and complete tetanus. So in wave summation, we'll talk about that one first. So in wave summation, what happens is your muscle tension increases because your contractions increase over time, and it's summed. So that is to say, one contraction is the summation of a previous contraction. It's a little bit different than TREPA. We'll take a look at this here in just a second on a graph. It's a little easier to see what's happening when we see it on the graph. Incomplete tetanus is when you only have partial relaxation in between contractions. So what you end up getting is a contraction, partial relaxation, you get a refiring. So you get something that looks like this. That's kind of what incomplete tetanus looks like. Okay. Now, complete tetanus looks something like this. This is basically where you get no relaxation. So you contract, and then now there's no relaxation. You're firing so quickly that you stay up there. You never relax. You never come down. Okay. So these are all part of it. Oftentimes you'll wave summate on your way up to an incomplete tetanus state or a tetanic state. but generally speaking, eventually you'll have to come back down because you have to relax at some point, right? So this is kind of what it looks like. So here you can see your twitch. So this would be an example of, trepo, where you have, well, actually trepo would actually have a little bit more of an increasing, something like that, right? So that kind of be what trepo looks like. Wave summation is a situation where you have a contraction, partial relaxation, but then what happens is you basically jump off of that previous wave, right? And you basically increase at that point. So that's a wave summation. So it's kind of like you're catapulting yourself off of the peak of the previous peak. So you never actually fully relax. In incomplete tetanus, here's a wave summation here. But now you can see you're basically never really relaxing. You're just sort of little micro relaxation, then contract, micro relaxation, then contract, but you stay up there. And then in complete tetanus, you contract, but you never relax. The stimulus coming at you. So for instance, here we see the stimulus is coming, boom here, boom here, boom here, boom here. In this one, you see a stimulus that comes boom here, and then it hits again, and then it hits again and again and again and again. So it's closer together. In this one, they're coming really close together. That's where your stimuli are, right? They're firing right next to each other. Boom, 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 boom. So you're never able to relax. And in this one, it's so fast, it's like you almost never feel any kind of a let go in between the stimuli. It's like constantly on. Okay. So the one thing to understand is there is a physiological role for tetanus, especially incomplete tetanus, right? So when your muscle is contracting over time, what's happening when it's doing constant is it's kind of like in a sort of an incomplete tetanic state. So what's happening is contracting, relaxing, just it's up there, but it's maintaining load, right? You can tell that because it's up high in the contraction curve. So it's kind of bouncing up and down. But when you're rotating motor units, what's happening is you're doing like a little bit of a relaxation and you're getting back in there. A little bit of relaxation, you're getting back up in there. Okay. So that's kind of what's happening. Now, if it's full tetanus, that means everybody's full tilt and they're all fired on. That's if this load gets really, really heavy. I incorporate all my motor units and it's not rotating anymore. Everybody's in there, right? So that's a tetanic state. That's when you're basically max tension against a very, very heavy load. Okay. You can't maintain that forever because you have to relax those muscles at some point, right? Well, when you're powerlifting, when it's over your head, your arms aren't really doing anything at that point. It's a lower body that's doing. Your arms really actually are relatively minor players when you're powerlifting like that. Because to get it up, you're basically using your body, your upper torso to pull it up. Your arms are doing a little bit of it, but what do you do when you get up here? You put it on your chest. Guess what? Your arms are out now, right? Because it's now your lower body that's bearing that weight. And then where your arms come into play is all you're doing is just doing a quick bench press from your chest where it's leaning on to over your head. That's where your arms come into play. But after that point, then it's your lower body. You're using your entire body to hold that up there. Okay. Is that a question, Haley? No, this is normal. This is what normal muscles do. You don't want to fatigue muscles. No, actually the worst phrase that's ever come out of fitness is feel the burn. Yeah, I agree. That basically, and that's Fonda who did that. Jane Fonda was the first one to come out with that, and she's stupid. Because that basically is somebody who does not have a clue about how physiology works. When you feel the burn, what's happening is you are doing damage to your body. If you're feeling the burn, there's two things that are happening. If it's at the beginning and you're feeling the burn, then all you're doing is anaerobic burning. That's all your lactic acid buildup. You're doing yourself absolutely zero good. So you never want to feel the burn. You always want to be able to breathe while you're working out, but you should not feel the burn. If you're feeling the burn after you've oxygenated, that is to say, after you've warmed up and you've got your breath about you, then what that means is you're doing your body more harm than good. So you're accumulating wear and tear more than you're actually getting benefit. And in general, unless you're trying to bulk up, which is where you're kind of doing micro damage to your muscles and they repair and they build more bulk, which is stupid. Because physiologically speaking, of course, right? I mean, if that's what you're going for because you're trying to get more strength and power, that's a different story. If you're trying to be a bodybuilder, you're doing it for different reasons. But if you're talking about physiological, which is where most people are, most people aren't in the gym to build muscle. They're not out there on Venice Beach trying to become, Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Or Lou Ferrigno, or whoever you want out there, right? Right. Most people are just like, listen, I just don't want to die of a heart attack today. Right. So in that case, especially as you get older, which is where a lot of people get stupider, is because when you get older, as you get older, the benefits of that kind of workout are actually much more faded than the costs. Because as you get older, your body is breaking down, you're getting more wear and tear. So you're thinking, oh, wait a minute, after 40, my muscle atrophy, so I'm going to start building bulk. Well, no, the problem is because when you start doing what you did when you were 20, what you're doing is you're actually putting more wear and tear on your joints, which means you're making it worse. So you're actually wearing and tearing your body more than you're benefiting. And that happens right around in middle age. Most fitness people don't get that because they're training 20-year-olds for like some sort of an athletic competition. And for them, connective tissue isn't a problem. But when you're getting up into your 30s and 40s, you really do have to be very smart about how you work out. You're not going to be able to do the things that you did when you were 20. You just got to get that past you got to get past yourself on that one, right? It's just not going to happen. Yes, that is gray hair. You got to get past it, right? Or no hair in some cases, right? You got to get past it, right? So yes, your muscles are atrophying, but at this particular point, when you're over 40, it's not about muscles. It's about physiology at that point. Because if you want to live for another 40 years, then you have to switch your workout regimen from bulk producing and athletic punishment, which is high wear and tear, to less wear and tear, right? Which is the reason why a lot of times like powerlifting is incredibly damaging to the body, because you're putting a ton of stress on your joints and on your body, and that will catch up to you as you get older, right? That's the reason why feel the burn is the dumbest thing that's ever come out, is because you're feeling the burn, like that basically means you're doing the wrong thing. Do something differently, right? Because you're not benefiting from it. You're doing damage to your tissues, you're increasing wear and tear, but you're not getting sufficient benefit from that. That makes sense? That's the reason why I like the workout regimens for older people from 40 plus are different. They're more like cardiovascular, they're more like whole body. They're not weight driven, right? If they're using weights, it's more things like 3 pounders, 5 pounders. It's consistent weight. It's more isometric in nature, right? They're looking at whole body. They're looking at those sorts of things. So it's a different approach to things, because you can't do the same things with a 40-year-old body that you did when you're 20. I'm sorry. It's just true, right? Ask any athlete that. How many football players retire around the age of late 30s, early 40s? Why? Because they can't do it the way they did it when they were 20. They know that. That's why they retire in their 40s, right? Or Tom Brady in his 80s, right? Because he's coming back, you know it. Going to play for another 20 years for the Raiders. Yes. I'm just kidding. Okay, maybe not. I know, right? Yeah, no. I don't think I'd want a 46-year-old playing on my team anyway. So, but anyway, even if he is Tom Brady. Okay, so that's neither here nor there. Right, so then of course, we get to diameter, right? So when we take a look at obviously greater diameter, that basically means more myofibrils, right? Which basically means more shortening, more sarcomeres to shorten, which means greater force, right? So you want to increase your diameter. And that'll increase your cross bridges, that'll increase your shortening, that'll increase everything, your force of contraction. And so that's kind of where that gets to. And that's kind of where that muscle development ging into. You're increasing the development, or the diameter rather, of existing muscle fibers. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of tension related issues, especially with respect to the idea of the time of contraction. So when we take a look at tension, we can break tension into sort of what's referred to as an active tension and a passive tension. And an active tension is basically what we'd usually think of as sort of a force that's applied to an object, right? So that's usually what we think of. But basically, you can sort of change this a little bit. So if you have an active tension curve, then you can always kind of increase or decrease your muscle fiber in length, right? I can do that, by the way, because I constantly do that, right? There's like little micro changes. Even if I'm like holding this here, like steady, there's still like little micro changes in my muscle, right? So it's actively kind of responding to that. If I put a little bit more pressure on there, it's going to change in length. Put a little less, it's going to change in length, right? So it's actively constantly happening. So you have this sort of change in active tension as it's basically, as is actually happening. But it's all dependent on the cross bridge formation, right? So you have to have the cross bridge formation. And so here's the thing though. So if I basically take my muscle and I stretch it out, which is going to give me as much active force as possible, I can stretch it too far, right? Remember the zone of overlap. So if I stretch it too far, I'll exceed the zone of overlap. That's not a good thing, right? Because what that basically means is then that there's no myosin heads overlapping with the actin in order for them to bind to it, okay? So I don't want to do that. I do want to stretch though, right? I want to stretch the sarcomere out so that I can get maximum contraction, but not so much where I overextend it and I start to lose cross bridge because I'm exceeding that zone of overlap, right? So I want as many myosin heads to match up with my actin as possible. However, what if I'm not stretched at all? Well, that's like a contraction thing, right? I have to stretch it out in order to be able to contract. So what this basically means is if I have too little stretching, then there's nowhere else for it to go, right? It's already fully contracted. So I've already met that limit. So there's really no contraction, very little contraction at all, if it's not stretched enough. So really what we want is we kind of want a sarcomere that gets stretched out just enough to sort of reset the system, but not so much that I sort of start to disturb this zone of overlap. I want one myosin head to be overlapping with one actin, right? So it has something to grab onto. So a passive tension then is basically when there's a tension applied to a load, when you have a stretched muscle, but it's not a stimulation sort of a thing. So basically, if I have, I'm trying to think of a good example of a passive tension. It's like when you put a tension on something, like during stretching or something like that. Like, I can't think of a good example of that. What? Yeah, that's a good one. Right. So basically, when you're kind of like, it's not a stimulation. So you're not stimulating the actual contraction of it, but it's applying sort of a load to that. Right. So it's a kind of passive load. So in this case, you're trying to undo something. Right. But that's basically kind of a passive form as opposed to an active force that's applied to it. Right. It's kind of like a secondary type of a passive thing. So you're not telling it to contract. It's just kind of like putting the pressure on it because of the nature of its stretching. So then the sum of these two is total tension, obviously dominated by active, right? So this is kind of what it looks like when you're taking a look at the zone of overlap. So here you can see, in this particular case, here's different muscle lengths. So here's a shortened muscle. So this is a fully contracted muscle here. So here you can see you've got maximum shortening. So there's nowhere else to go, right? Your actin basically is already met in the middle. This is a fully contracted sarcomere. There's nowhere else here to go. Then if you basically stretch this out, this is a relaxed muscle. You can see your zone of overlap here, which is this right here, right? You want those myosin heads to be in contact with an actin. So you have maximum contact between myosin heads and actin. So that's an increased zone of overlap. It's a nicely relaxed muscle. And now you're ready to sort of squeeze this together. But what happens if you overextend? Well, this is what happens here. Notice there's no zone of overlap. So what is the myosin head going to grab onto? Right? It's grabbing onto the air. It's like, you kind of exceeded the system. You sort of like overextended the system. This is a little too much stretch, right? So in this particular case, you'll notice that the sarcomeric length that you want is somewhere right in the middle. You want a good healthy zone of overlap, but you want every myosin head to be in contact with actin, right? That's a good healthy overlap. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So notice here, you're going to get a shortened contraction. So that's kind of like not as much contraction as normal. You get a much more robust contraction here, and you get nothing there because there's nothing to grab onto, right? This would be a situation like maybe, especially like if you use antagonistic muscles, like if you use an extensor flexor sort of a thing. If you extend, like hyperextend, perhaps you can actually overstretch your bicep, for instance, like especially if you break your arm and it kind of bends backwards, you're going to be pulling extra hard in your bicep. So there's probably going to be a lot of sarcomeres in there that will get a little overextended in there.
So then you can't like.
Well, I mean, you'll probably be able to do that because you're just talking about one sarcomere. In order to really disable your bicep, you would have to have this happening to all the sarcomeres of all the motor units and all the muscle fibers in the bicep. The chances of that happening are fairly remote. There's probably going to be at least enough muscle fibers in there to be able to get you some, something, but you'll feel it, right? You'll feel that tension. And I mean, it's obviously, that's pretty dramatic there. I mean, that's going to be pretty painful. But generally speaking, I mean, you can kind of get this back in. I mean, eventually, over time, that zone of overlap will kind of get itself worked back in. Just like the muscle kind of rebuilds itself pretty well that way. Yeah.
Butterflies, and then reach tracks and hold that weight back up. Yeah, you pull those sarcomeres, not only in your chest but in your arms. So your butterflies. This way,
yeah,
totally different than,
yeah, because you kind of overstretch it a little bit, right, and then it kind of exceeds that, and then you're kind of that's a good example. Yeah, I mean, whenever you're pulling a muscle, I mean, a lot of times, I mean, depending on what it is, there's pulling and straining are oftentimes confused. What most people usually refer to as a pulled muscle is actually a strained muscle, which is a little bit different. Technically speaking, a pulled muscle would be an overextended muscle, which is kind of like what we're talking about, where you're overextending in this situation. Most of the time when you're working on a hamstring, it's a strained muscle. Yeah. And so it's more of like an over contraction. So it's going the opposite direction. And it tends to have, and there's different things, right? Because you've got a lot of things going on here. I mean, this is just sort of scratching the surface of muscle physiology. You'd probably have to have an entire semester of muscle physiology to really get into the nuances of things, like, because you can take different things to kind of help keep the muscles from tightening up and things of that nature. You can massage them out. So there's a lot of mechanical pieces to this. There's a lot of blood flow capacity to this. There's a lot of issues associated with that. A lot of your cramping is associated with blood flow deficiencies because the muscles require oxygen. And sometimes if you get deoxygenated in a particular area, you're going to feel that. And so that's a lot of the reason why a lot of times kind of rubbing or massaging that area restores the blood flow, because you're getting that venous blood flow moving back through that muscle, which is kind of getting that circulation going back again, getting those muscles back in, but you're still feeling it. So there's a lot of things that are going on there when you're talking about muscles and how they work. We could probably do an entire chapter just on muscle kinesiology is basically what it is by itself. Yeah, Haley.
I've always wondered like if they have a different acid feel like if they're always kind of on the brink of pulling off.
Well, dancers are outliers, especially ballet dancers. Not all dancers, because not all dance is actually technically interesting. But when you're looking at that, wait, was that kind of a little edgy? That was, I've been a little snarky like all week long. So yeah, I mean, I started off, so, so, but anyway, no, seriously though, because if you look at ballet, I mean, the demands that the moves in ballet require on the body are unlike a lot of other types of dance. I mean, and when you look at how a ballet dancer prepares and trains for ballet, I mean, it is no joke. I mean, there's some stuff there that would make like CrossFit people cry. I mean, and it's supposed to be ballet, you know, it's like ballet, and they're very much outliers. So the way they've got their muscles trained for like an equality of strength to get those leaps, but also agility and tone so that they can get the flexibility and the grace. I mean, it is probably one of the most like significant types of training you can do for the body, because most people do one or the other. They'll train for tonality or agility, or they'll train for bulk and power, but ballet does it for both. And that's hard to pull off. And if you look at some of the workouts they do, it is serious business. But yeah, they are on the edge like all the time. I mean, anybody who can stand on their toes, they have my vote. I mean, I'm just saying, but I've seen ballet dancers, like really good ones, like from the Russian or the Moscow Ballet or San Francisco Ballet. I mean, they do some stuff that's just like it's like a violation of physics. I mean, it's just like, how can you do that? Like at San Francisco Ballet, I remember I went to a rehearsal once for a ballet. I don't remember, I was a kid, but like the one ballet guy, one of the first things that I remember, he had like a stick, and he would basically just lean on the stick, and he would essentially just like, and he would like use at a 45-degree angle with his body just on the stick. And he would just kind of like lower himself down slowly, just like this, just balancing on the stick. It was amazing. I had no idea how he did it. It's like levitating. And he was just like, I started watching that. I'm like, how can you do that? I mean, it's just amazing what they can do. And that's the reason, but usually you see those individuals, like those really, really good ones, they're usually the big shot companies. So you got to go to places like San Francisco or Moscow or New York or something like that to see those ones. I mean, the ones we have here, they're good, but they're not like them, right? I mean, they levitate. Yeah. So if you can see like Moscow in particular, because I mean, they're like, I'd probably say they're internationally one of the biggest, one of the top shots. I mean, that's where Baryshnikov, I think, came from back in the day.
I was a little girl and they had like auditions for just like little in their Moscow Ballet, not like anything on their level.
Like the little kids section, yeah, like the Nutcracker where you get to be one of the kids running around. Yeah.
I remember pulling my hamstring coming off, and one of the ballerinas was so angry. She was so upset because that's like their life. And, you know, I had ruined it, you know, and I came off and I felt so bad. I was like proud. My dance teacher was like, but you could tell everyone was so mad at me.
Yeah, ballet's no joke. Ballet's no joke. A lot of people think of it's like, oh, isn't that pretty and it's graceful and we're all sweet and friends. It's like, no, it's grueling and hard. And what they do, they make it look that way because they're good. I mean, the fact that you don't see what it actually takes to do that is like an amazing testament to their craft, actually, which is the reason why ballet is like one of my favorite performing arts. Like even above concerts and stuff like that, I'll always go to the ballet because I know what it's like. Wow.
Have you ever seen a good orchestra where all the bows are just everyone is in sync?
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. If you're going to a ballet, you still get the orchestra.
You do. Yeah, you do. You do. So, but so when we take a look, that's on. So basically then, but no, that was by the way, if you're looking for a good ballet, Dracula, one of my favorites.
It is a good.
Yeah, for a modern ballet, I'm not the biggest fan of the more modern ones because they get a little avant-garde. And I'm kind of more of a traditionalist. I like those traditional ballets. But man, Dracula was probably one of the best ballets I've ever seen. The music was great. The staging was awesome. The dance, the choreography was amazing. I mean, after the first act, I literally had chills. I mean, I was just like, my jaw was open. I mean, because it's basically like the Bram Stoker's Dracula. That's basically what it is the old movie Dracula. That's essentially it. So you know the story already. But man, and I'd seen that movie a million times. But those are classic. Yeah, Phantom of the Opera. Those are some classic performances. Yeah, those are. But for a new one, for a newbie on the street, I thought Dracula was, because I was thinking, oh, well, this is going to be like, whatever. I was like blown away because I was like, oh my gosh, this is like amazing the way they did this. This is one of my favorites.
I saw the ads for that. I wanted to see that.
Yeah, if you get a chance to see it, go see it. It's an awesome ballet. It's a great way to start your ballet, tour. Before you get to the hardcore stuff.
The surf performances,
Hmm.
like things that their body does as well.
Yeah, Cirque du Soleil. Yeah, there's a lot of that, but that's kind of like an offshoot. What they do is basically kind of a mutation of traditional ballet, essentially. Basically take your body and make it do weird things. So, but you need motor units to do that, right? Like that? Yeah, you like that segue then? Motor units to do that. But anyway, so if you take a look at contraction, right? So this is kind of whole movement. So what I was talking about the rotation idea is kind of like the recruitment idea. So essentially what you have the capacity to do is to recruit the necessary motor units. So how many do you need? You can recruit them, right? So for instance, if you take a look at your threshold, so you have a certain stimulus, right? We always have this stimulus threshold, right? Everything is threshold driven. So you get to your threshold, and once you meet threshold, then you have one motor unit response. So notice you get this little itty bitty contraction. And then ultimately, what's going to happen is you're going to have what's called submaximal stimuli. So you have increasing motor units that's basically increasing in strength as you recruit more motor units. So you're basically saying, we need more tension here because this load is heavy. So we need to match the load with our motor units. So you can see you get increasing contraction as you add these extra motor units until you basically max out your contraction. And so that's basically where you get your maximum recruitment. And in that case, what's happened is I've met my load. Okay. Now, once you're at maximal, that's when you start to do the rotation. So you start to rotate to maintain maximal tension. So you recruit to get to it, and then you rotate to maintain it. Okay. That's kind of how you work with your motor units. So when you take a look at it, you've got sub-threshold stimulus, right? So you have basically no action potential, no contraction. That basically means it's not there yet. Once you reach threshold, your action potential comes through. So you get a little itty bitty contraction. Submaximal stimuli is you create a stronger stimulus for the purpose of adding more motor units, right, to increase your response. And then, of course, you get to maximal, where you get all of your motor units working together. And so you can kind of use your stimulus in this particular case to get to your max motor units. Notice if you do more stimulus, you don't get any benefit. So you've plateaued at this point. That's what supramaximal is. So it doesn't matter if you do more stimulus at this particular point because you've already gotten there. You're not going to get more motor units. You don't have more motor units to give. So you're at your max. What happens if your load still exceeds your tension? You're going down, right? That's when you add your other paw in there to add another batch of tension in there, right? And then not only that, but guess what? If I've got both hands in there, then I've got both muscles working together, managing recruitment and rotation, and they're working off each other. Oh, my right hand is a little bit more of it, so my left hand's going to back up. My left hand is a little bit more of it, so my right hand's going to back up. So your two biceps are actually working in concert with each other as you're doing both of them. It's like they're talking to each other. which is crazy. Yeah, right. So the size principle. So what happens first of all? Well, the size principle basically starts that says this. You start small, right? Basically use the fewest necessary to achieve your effect. If you can get away with smaller motor units, guess what? Use them. Leave your big ones alone, right? Only use what you need. So start small, grow and recruit big. That's the size principle. Now, tonality in tone, and this is, by the way, the idea of tonality is not just muscle tone. We think of it as muscle tone, but there's also physiological tone. We talk about tonality a lot in AMP too, right? All tonality is basically a constant, in this case, constant tension. But tonality is basically a constant state. A constant state of readiness. That's what tonality is. So for muscle tone, it basically means your muscles are in a constant state of readiness. So it's easier for them to contract when they go from this constant tension to a greater tension than if they were at flatline zero, right? So that's the reason why you improve muscle tone, because the better muscle tone you have, it means the more better wired your muscles are to actually respond to loads. In physiology, your physiological tone is basically a kind of a basal rate of physiology, where you're constantly sort of always humming in the background, so that you can easily launch off of that to either increase or decrease from that reference point, right? That way you don't have to start from zero. You're always kind of have this basal rate going on in the background. That's the basic concept of tonality, right? Is this kind of constant state of readiness. Now, when we take a look at the different types of contractions, so we have isotonic, right? So this is the one where you change in length, but not in tension. So you either have concentric or eccentric. So in this particular case, in concentric, you overcome your opposing resistance, right? And your muscle shortens. So that's basically what's happening there. And eccentric, basically, this is where your tension is maintained. But in this case, the resistance is allowing or causing your muscle to lengthen, right? So it's kind of a slightly different. So it's kind of a bit more of a continuous type of a situation, or continuous type of resistance that's happening in one place. So slow versus fast twitch. So your muscles are actually broken down into slow and fast twitch. And which, by the way, is kind of a technical term for light meat and dark meat. And all the vegans were like, seriously, did you have to do that? Yes, I had to. It just needed to happen. But yeah, so this is kind of where your light meat. So what does slow twitch do, right? So this is kind of like your type 1 twitch fiber. So typically what happens is, typically with slow twitch, they have a slower contraction about them. They tend to be fairly small in diameter. They have a lot of blood supply, right, to them. More mitochondria, so that's important. They tend to resist fatigue. So these are endurance muscles. And they tend to have a lot of myoglobin. What's myoglobin? This is basically the storage form. It basically has a storage type of a globin. Yep, and it stores oxygen. So hemoglobin is what's in your blood, but hemoglobin basically has the ability to grab onto oxygen in some circumstances and let it go in others. Myoglobin is much greedier, has a greater affinity for oxygen. So when it grabs on oxygen, it hangs on to it and doesn't let it go, which is the reason why your blood is not made up of myoglobin, it's made up of hemoglobin. But tissues that need to store oxygen oftentimes will have myoglobin, because myoglobin will grab onto the oxygen and hang on to it. And so that'll be like a reservoir of oxygen in there. Yes. So there's several organs that do that. And usually, like muscle, another one will do that, slow twitch. Typically speaking, they all have the same thing in common. they have like a long-term longitudinal endurance-like activity that they need the oxygen for. Think about this. We just said that slow twitch muscles basically are the endurance muscles. So what they're doing is they are contracting slower for longer periods of time, right? Which basically means what? Which means they need more ATP in order to do this for a long period of time. If you need more ATP, what do you need more of? Oxygen, which means you need better blood supply. That's where the oxygen is coming from, right? You also need a lot of mitochondria, because once you have the oxygen, which organelle is the one that's responsible for making ATP? The mitochondria. This is the reason why you have lots of mitochondria there, right? And then, of course, to make sure that you have plenty of oxygen, you have myoglobin to make sure that you never run out. So what you essentially have is a type of muscle that's designed to basically pack supplies for a long period of time. Why? Because it is a slow contractor. It is an endurance muscle. It's a muscle that's designed to work and operate at a low level, but for long periods of time. Postural muscles are example, right? But because of their greater blood supply, they oftentimes will be dark. You dark meat lovers. So yes, the meat is dark because it's bloody. You like that? That should appeal to your inner carnivore. You're like, yeah. This is an all-out assault on vegans, right? No, but that's the reason why it's dark. It's dark because of the blood. That's what it is. What do you mean?
Like, is there a different nutritional value because they have like more mitochondria?
No, it's just more, there's just more blood supply there. And there's more blood there. Well, by the time you eat the dark meat, by the time you cook the chicken, hopefully you're cooking the chicken. Yeah, okay, that we can agree on, okay. Right, by the time you cook it, the oxygen's long gone. So everything's been denatured, the proteins are denatured, the mitochondria is blitzed. So basically it's all the same at that point. You just have the leftovers of the blood effect on the actual tissue itself. So the darkerness is because of the extra vascularization that was in there. But it's not like there's going to be functional blood cells in there unless you're eating it raw. Right. So
Oh, it's so much better.
yeah, a lot of people, that's the reason why you got people who like dark meat. You know, they order up the dark meat. But that's because, I mean, there's obviously different things in there and you're tasting more. That's probably your inner carnivore tasting the bloodlust. Right. It's like, I'm a dark meat person, so I love the blood, right? So you go for the blood. If you're an animal, you're probably eating and gorging on the animal's livers and kidneys and stuff like that, right? So that's just, by the way, that's what they do. That's what carnivores do, right? Watch a lion. He's not sitting there gnawing on the drumstick. He's in there digging out the liver. He's digging out the kidneys and the heart. He's going for the organs, right? That's what they do. Yeah. Because that's where a lot of for them, the nutrition and the fats and stuff like that are. What about fast twitch? They're just the opposite. So these are rapid responders, right? So basically, they have a kind of myosin that will actually break down ATP a lot faster than type 1. So these guys are geared for fast sprints. Right. So if this was basically, if the slow twitch was your endurance, this is your sprinters, right? So if you're responding quickly, guess what? You're going to need less blood supply, right? Because you're responding very fast. You're not an endurance thing. There's going to be fewer mitochondria. You're not going to need as much oxygen as slow twitch because you're going to be doing this very, very quickly. Now, these are basically sprinter muscles, right? Lower limb legs, the upper limbs of most people. This is your white meat for all you chicken lovers, right? So oftentimes the reason why you have less oxygen requirements is because a lot of what you're doing is anaerobic in nature. Because this is like the cheetah, perfect example. When the cheetah is running, the cheetah is making maximum use of the fast twitch muscles. They only last a short period of time. Why? Because you don't have a deep endless reservoir of anaerobic molecules. So you can only do anaerobic for a short period of time before you run out, and then you're done, right? This is the reason why we can't sprint a mile, right? We have to sort of, we start off, but we have to kind of pace ourselves. We have to drop ourselves into a more endurance mode, right? This is also the reason why you don't sprint through a marathon. Half of you guys are like, I'm not running a mile at all, right? Well, that's because he's well conditioned, but you're not sprinting through it, right? You're not doing like a, so you're not going to be doing like if you're doing a 4.240 or something like that, you're not going to be doing that for 26 miles because metabolically you don't have that. Why? Because you have to switch to your slow twitch muscles, which are your endurance muscles, and that's what's going to keep you going long term. So the marathon runners are basically maximizing slow twitch, whereas the sprinters are maximizing fast twitch, right? So those are the two different types. Then, of course, when you take a look at your fiber types, right, you take a look at change in size. I always like this one, right? So hypertrophy, hyper, more than, trophy, the development of. So this is your increase in muscle size. Usually it's because of your increase in myofibrils, not the number of muscle fibers. We're here to talk about that one. And so you can also increase your nuclei if you fuse together your satellite cells, which are cells that are in the muscle fiber or around the muscle fiber itself. So you kind of fuse them together and you kind of create these polynucleic or nuclei cells themselves. And then you can also, and this is kind of where a lot of these sort of fitness trainers get into, you can also increase strength, not just by actually increasing muscle size, but you can also do it by coordination as well. And by increasing metabolism and circulation. And guess what? You get that stomach out of the way, then you can do more, right? And that's the thing, because I know, like, when I get to a certain, like, after the holidays, usually, I can actually feel, like, my padding. I can actually start to feel it, and I can feel like, well, wait a minute, okay, I can feel that. So I kind of have a gauge of like, okay, I need to work out more or something like that. So that's a restriction sort of a thing. And different individuals will have obviously fat deposits in different areas, but it will restrict potentially sometimes range of motion. But as you're working out, and this is kind of the reason why you see things like these kind of workout folks that aren't doing it for like, you know, high intensity sort of stuff. They're obviously like more normal people. And they're just saying, listen, you need to just get in your living room and exercise, right? Whatever you do. Like people like Denise Austin come to mind, right? Who are kind of like more of the low key types. They're not like the Jillian Michaels where they're like, you know, give me 20 maggot, right? That kind of piece, you know. They're not like that. They're more like, you know, listen, we're going to work the whole body. We're going to do different things. We're going to do cardio. We're going to do stretches. We're going to do some strength. We're going to do lots of different things. We're going to coordinate our muscles because we're doing both upper and lower. And so, you know, there's a lot of those out there. Denise Austin was just the one that my wife loves. But there's a lot of folks out there who do it like that, who's whole body, and they're all about coordination and getting as many parts of the body working at the same time as possible. That's coordination of body. And then as you do that over time, you can feel that you don't have any one muscle getting big, but you can feel your whole body basically gaining in strength, right? So it's kind of like it's almost like your tonality is starting to move up, right, a little bit. And so you can feel that. And along with that comes obviously your metabolism, right? So the better your body responds like magic to two things, to good diet and exercise. Exercise is like magic fairy dust. Physiologically, half of the positive benefits we don't even understand, but we know that it improves almost every physiological metric in the body, and we don't understand. Like even like somebody's like, oh, I got cancer. Well, work out. What? I don't feel like working out. No, work out. That's the best thing you do. Don't like beat yourself to death, but just do what you can. Get your body active. It's like that. Just having your body craves to be active, to be moving, to be used, and to be balanced. And when you get there, it's like physiological magic. It improves everything about the way your body works. And we don't understand half of that for the most part. Then, of course, if you're going to have hypertrophy on the other side, you're going to have atrophy as well, right? Which is basically a decrease in muscle size, where you're basically going to be reducing the number of myofibrils and it's going to get smaller and smaller. Right? So your skeletal muscles will be big heat producers. Why? Because of your metabolic heat production. So you're going to basically during obviously an exercise, you're going to be producing a lot of metabolism, which is going to be increasing the heat, which is the reason why you get hot when you exercise. Ultimately, right after you exercise, your metabolic rate stays high, right? Your physiology doesn't just stop because you did. It takes a little bit to sort of for your physiology to step down. It took a little bit for it to get up. It takes a little bit for it to step down, right? This is the reason why you kind of do warm ups to kind of get yourself there. And then why you do warm downs to sort of allow your physiology to sort of step down. So you're trying to step down your physical activity along with your physiological activity. So it's not so jarring, okay? But ultimately your excess heat will basically be lost oftentimes through skin and sweating, right? Through vasodilation, which is the dilation of your blood vessels in your skin. And that's going to be bringing the body heat to the surface where you can sweat it off and you can release it through your sweat. So that's going to be your heat loss. But that's also the reason why a lot of times when you're working out, you get red. The reason why you're getting red is because you're increasing your body heat, and that body heat is those vessels are dilating, and you're shedding that excess heat through your skin. That's why you're getting red. Huh? Exactly. Yep. And that's exactly what happens. All those blood vessels in the dermis, basically they move, the blood gets shunted up toward the surface of the skin so that it can transfer that heat to your sweat. And that's the reason why you get red when you work out, because you're shedding excess heat. The opposite then, of course, is true. If you get too cold, you start shivering in order to generate heat, and that brings your core body temperature back up. Right. So we already talked about that a little bit before. So since we're at our witching hour, energy sources of muscle contraction is a good place to start next time. And we'll probably go ahead and finish off pretty easily this chapter, and we'll get a start on 11. Yes, I am aware of it. I'm aware that we have very few days left, and we have a lot of chapters on the table. The way neuro works, and this way it's designed to work actually, is chapter 11, the next chapter, has heavy overlap with this chapter. So what we don't know is that while we're learning muscles, especially like neuromuscular junction and all that action potential, stuff like that, we've already learned probably at least a third of chapter 11. So chapter 11, those parts are going to go quickly because I'm not going to recapitulate what we've already laid down. Okay. So the next chapter will go quickly. Now, the other chapters, spinal cord and brain, those ones will be cherry picked. At this particular point in the semester, and it always happens, I switch from, okay, we're in AMP1 to, okay, now I got to get you ready for AMP2. And as a result, when I sit down to the nervous system, I do everything. The first question I ask is, what do you need to know when you go into AMP2? And that's the nature of the cherry pick. Okay, so the things that we see in the remaining chapters, 13 and 15 in particular, are basically an intentional cherry picking or an omission, because it's like, listen, this is great if you know it, but what you need to know for 202 on day one, this is what we need to cover first. Okay. And those are the things we work on first. And it's also the things we use the neuro lab, which we only have 2 labs for neuro. That's also the things we work on in the neuro lab as well. So the lab and the lecture work hand in hand to get us the coverage that we need in order to be ready on day 1 of AMP2. Okay. So even though it looks like there's a ton of chapters left and not a whole lot of time left, cherry picking can be, when I cherry pick very, very aggressively. So it's like this right here, and then the rest of that goes. So that's what I want, right? So I get very, very picky at this point in the semester.
Is that like you would take out sections of it? Or
No, the slides will be there. The slides will be there. What I will do is because some semesters we have more time than others, and we can cover more of it. So the slides will still be there. What I'll do is I'll go to certain sections and I'll zero in on a slide and say, like, this topic here, let's cover this one. Okay. And then that's kind of how I'll do it. So you'll have the rest of it, because sometimes when you're kind of looking at it, it helps if you have a little bit of time to kind of take a look at what came before and after to give you some context. So that piece made more sense. And so it kind of fits together a bit more. Okay. So we have about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll get neuro started. And then I have to run down the hall and get your guys' handouts printed out for the neuro piece of it. And then we'll start the final stretch.